The desert night leaned close, listening. Coyotes worried the ridgelines, and the Apache campfire flung red light up the cottonwoods. A lone rider came in slow. He dismounted without a word and stood in the glow. A tall, dust-whipped man, hat brim low, hand near the worn grip of his revolver. They knew his name, Jesse Marlowe. Trailhand, sometime scout, a drifter whose boots had crossed more counties than a census clerk could list. He had ridden for cattle kings and for no one at all, slept under chaparral and church roofs. None of that brought him here. He had come for a woman, the chief's daughter, Tala, whose beauty folks said could split a man's resolve like an obsidian blade. Red Hawk, the Apache chief, sat with the stillness of stone. Scars tracked his chest like pale rivers. His eyes were the steady kind that measure men the way a hunter measures distance. When Jesse's boots hit gravel, the camp quieted. A boy fed the fire, sparks twisted upward like tiny souls finding sky. "You dare come here," Red Hawk said in rough English. "For my daughter," Jesse's voice came calm, dry as mesquite. "I ain't here to steal. I came to claim her proper, if she'll have me. I'll face any man who stands between." The words struck the circle like thrown gravel. Spears shifted. At the back of the ring, a woman's breath caught. Tala, hair dark as a raven's wing, bracelets chiming at her wrist. Her eyes met Jesse's for a heartbeat. Fear lived there, and something else. A coal he knew from a riverbank afternoon when she pressed 2 fingers to his lips and taught him to be quiet. Red Hawk rose, taller than his shadow. "You want her?" Then bleed for clear to his ear. Wind came cold off the hills. Horses stamped in the dark. The drum paused, then started again, softer, like a heart worn by grief. Jesse closed his eyes and listened. Mesquite sap popping. A spear butt ticking stone. The small sound a person makes when courage slips and they drag it back. When he opened his eyes, Tala stood at the edge of light. "Go," she whispered in Spanish, the language they shared better than his Apache or her hard English. "They will kill you." "I know," he said, "but I ain't leaving you behind." "My father's law is old." She touched the soot marks on his wrist, pressing them darker. "This means the spirits saw you. Seen men cannot hide." Jesse tried a smile meant only for her. "I never was much good at hiding." She slipped back into the dark, like water taking its shape. The stars wheeled, clear and cold. Somewhere a horse shook its tack. He turned his palms to the heat and let it eat the stiffness from his fingers. A memory rose. The cottonwood by the river where she named things for him. River, sky, hawk, until the sounds felt honest. He had given her the only riches a drifter owns, a tin mirror, a feed store ribbon the color of dusk, and a promise to come back standing. With a tribe's eyes on his back, that promise weighed more than iron. Ash spiraled from the pit. A child laughed in sleep. A woman hummed a tune to keep fear out of the circle. Jesse breathed with the song until his breath steadied. He lifted his face to the stars and chose one to carry his prayer. Not fine words, only the plain request that a man be given strength to hold ground at dawn. The drum went quiet as a heart at rest. The east began to dawn did not come gentle. It bled across the horizon like a knife drawn slow, spilling color into the night. The Apache camp stirred with the rhythm of war, men painting their faces with ash and ochre, women whispering prayers into the wind. In the center, Jesse Marlowe sat rigid by the dying fire, watching the sparks fade like the chances of a man who had gambled too much. The drumbeats quickened. Warriors moved around him, circling like wolves that had scented weakness. Some spat near his boots. Others laughed with the kind of mirth that carried no joy. Jesse knew the sound. It was the same jeer he'd heard in border towns when crowds gathered for a hanging. Two elders stepped forward, carrying wooden poles wrapped in feathers. They spoke in their tongue, harsh and sharp. Jesse caught only fragments, words that meant trial, blood, and sacrifice. Red Hawk answered them with a single nod, his face carved into a mask of granite. A youth barely past boyhood strode into the circle and pointed a spear toward Jesse's chest. His body gleamed with paint, his eyes hot with the fury of proving himself. Jesse rose slowly, boots grinding into gravel. He did not reach for his revolver. This wasn't the time for iron. He spread his hands, palms open. The boy lunged, the spear tip grazing Jesse's shirt. Jesse sidestepped, caught the shaft, and wrenched it sideways with the strength of a man who had hauled more steers than most would ever see. The youth hit the dirt hard. A roar went up, some laughing, some shouting curses. Jesse dropped the spear at the boy's feet and stepped back. Red Hawk raised a hand and silence returned like a door slamming shut. His gaze fixed on Jesse, unreadable, but there was a flicker of something. Acknowledgement, perhaps, that the cowboy had not killed when he could have. The elders spoke again, climbing past his knees, then his waist. The log dragged him sideways, the river pulling with greedy hands. His boots slipped on slick stone, and for a moment the world turned white with the thought of failure. He heard laughter from the bank, harsh and eager, but then he saw her. Tala stood apart from the others, her hands clenched at her chest, lips moving in prayer or plea. Her eyes burned into his, and strength surged like whiskey in his blood. Jesse braced, shoved forward, step by agonizing step. The current tore at him, but he pushed through, teeth grinding, every muscle aflame. When he stumbled onto the far bank, collapsing to his knees, the camp erupted in noise, some in disbelief, some in anger. Jesse lifted his head, breath ragged but unbroken. The log thudded onto the dirt. He looked at Red Hawk across the river. The chief's face did not change, but his silence was louder than any shout. The trials ended as the sun climbed higher. Jesse was dragged back into the circle, body aching, lungs burning. His hands shook, though he clenched them into fists. Around him the warriors beat their spears against the ground in a rhythm that spoke of blood to come. Tala slipped closer, shadowed by the women of the tribe. Her eyes found him through the smoke and dust. For a heartbeat, it felt as though the world held only the two of them, bound by something stronger than law. Then Red Hawk's voice cut through the noise. "At high sun, you fight. One man will stand. One man will fall. The camp howled agreement, and Jesse knew the shadow of the tribe would not rest until it was fed. The sun climbed until it burned white in the sky. Shadows shrank, and the land seemed to quiver under the heat. Jesse Marlowe stood in the center of the Apache circle, every muscle screaming from the trials of dawn. His boots were scorched, his lungs raw from river water and smoke, yet his eyes never left the figure across from him. Red Hawk, the chief, the man who held both the tribe's honor and his daughter's future in his calloused hands. The warriors beat their spears against the earth, each thud a drumbeat of judgment. Children perched on rocks, their faces painted, their eyes wide. Women gathered in the shade of the cottonwoods, murmuring prayers or curses Jesse couldn't tell. And there, just beyond the ring, Tala stood as if carved from silence. Her dark eyes burned with fire and sorrow both, a storm no desert wind could scatter. Jesse flexed his fingers, feeling the ache. He carried no revolver now, only the knife they had given him, short, crude, chipped from stone. It was an equalizer of sorts. In this circle, no man's iron would sing, only the edge of tradition. Red Hawk stepped forward. His body was painted with black stripes, his chest bare, muscles corded like the trunks of old trees. In his hand was a blade carved from bone, bound with hide. The crowd hushed as he raised it to the sky. "You came for love," he said, his English deliberate, heavy as iron. "But love cannot live without blood. Today, you prove if your heart is strong enough to stand against the blade." The words struck Jesse harder than the heat. He knew this was more than a duel. It was judgment, of him, of Tala, of the possibility that love could cross the canyon between their worlds. The circle closed. A war cry split the air, and Red Hawk lunged. Jesse barely dodged. Sweat and blood mingled, staining the dust dark. Jesse's vision blurred, yet he clung to the single anchor that held him upright. Tala's gaze. Every step, every swing, every breath was for her. For a heartbeat, time slowed. Jesse saw not the chief before him but the woman at the river, laughing as water sparkled around her ankles. He saw the promise he had made under the cottonwood, and he knew that if he died here, it would not be fear that claimed him, but the failure of breaking that vow. With a growl, he lunged. Their blades met, bone against stone, sparks of raw will rather than fire. Red Hawk's strength bore down, nearly breaking Jesse's arm. Jesse gritted his teeth, muscles screaming and twisted. The crude stone edge sliced a shallow line across the chief's shoulder. Blood welled, dark against painted skin. The crowd erupted, half in fury, half in awe. Some warriors surged forward, only to be held back by the elders. Red Hawk stood tall, blood running down his arm, his chest rising like a bellows. He looked at Jesse, and for the first time, the mask cracked. There was respect in his eyes, grim, unwilling, but undeniable. Still, the fight was not done. Both men staggered, circling once more, their shadows tangled in the dust, their hearts beating like war drums. Jesse's hand trembled, but he held the knife firm. Red Hawk raised his blade high, ready for the strike that could end everything. And in that instant, Tala cried out. Her voice cut through the chants, through the heat, through the centuries of hatred. "Father! Stop!" The circle froze. Even the wind seemed to pause. Jesse's breath came ragged.
The circle held its breath. Tala's cry still trembled in the air, fragile as glass yet strong enough to freeze every hand. Red Hawk's blade hovered inches from Jesse's throat, a line of sunlight flashing along the bone edge. Jesse's chest rose and fell, each breath raw with blood and dust. The tribe stood silent, torn between the law of ancestors and the voice of their chief's daughter. The silence shattered with the drums. A slow boom, then another, rolling through the canyon like thunder. The warriors answered with a roar, stamping their spears into the ground. Dust lifted in choking clouds. Red Hawk lowered his blade but did not sheath it. His eyes burned, torn between fury and the weight of a father's love. "You are not yet worthy," he said, voice like gravel ground under iron. "The blood is not finished." Jesse's hand tightened on the crude knife. His body screamed for rest, but he straightened. "Then finish it," he rasped. "One of us leaves this circle standing." The chief gave a nod, small and final. The drums quickened, pounding like 100 hearts. Warriors circled tighter, their chants rising, a wall of sound that pushed Jesse and Red Hawk toward destiny. They clashed again. Bone struck stone, the impact ringing sharp. Jesse's arm jarred, pain screaming up to his shoulder. Red Hawk's strike drove him backward, feet sliding in the dust. Jesse countered with a slash, carving air, missing by inches. Sweat poured into his eyes, stinging, blinding. The crowd howled. Some demanded Jesse's death, others called for mercy, their voices tangled into chaos. Tala pressed forward, but 2 women seized her arms, holding her back. She struggled, her cries lost under the storm of war. Red Hawk swung low, forcing Jesse to leap aside. His boot caught a rock and he fell hard, the knife skittering across the dirt. A cheer erupted. Victory seemed near. Red Hawk advanced, blade raised high. But Jesse rolled, grabbed a handful of dust and flung it upward. The chief blinked, dark and hot. Red Hawk staggered, but his grip did not falter. He swung back, slicing Jesse's shoulder. Both men reeled, crimson dripping into the dust, staining it black. The tribe screamed, the chant now a frenzy. Spears pounded like thunderbolts. Dust rose until the sun itself seemed to vanish behind a red haze. Tala tore free from the women and rushed forward, falling to her knees at the edge of the circle. "Stop this!" she cried, her voice breaking. "Blood will not heal hate." Neither man heard. They were beyond words, beyond reason. Only the drums spoke now, carrying them toward an end neither could escape. Jesse stumbled, nearly falling. Red Hawk's blade arced toward his chest. At the last instant, Jesse caught the chief's wrist, the bone blade inches from his heart. They froze, locked in a deadly embrace. Every muscle screamed, every vein burned. The drums pounded faster, faster, until they became the sound of one great heart. The tribe's chants reached a fever pitch, calling for blood, for victory, for the will of the ancestors. And then, silence. The drums stopped mid-beat. The chants died on the wind. Jesse and Red Hawk stood motionless, blades locked, breath ragged. The tribe watched, caught between rage and awe. Tala's sobs carried across the circle, the only sound left in the world. The moment stretched thin, ready to snap. The drums would begin again, or they would not. One man would fall,
or both? The choice hung heavy in the stillness, as sharp as the blades they held.
The silence pressed heavy, thicker than the desert heat. Jesse and Red Hawk stood locked together, blades trembling, muscles screaming, neither yielding an inch. Around them the tribe waited, breath held, eyes wide. The fate of law and love balanced on the knife edge between them. A single raven wheeled overhead, its cry splitting the stillness. The omen was not lost on the people. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Old words whispered. Signs. Spirits. Destiny. Tala's sobs carried across the circle. Her voice the only human sound left. Jesse's strength waned. His arms shook, the crude stone knife slipping in his sweat-slicked palm. He could feel Red Hawk's power, relentless, pressing down like the weight of a mountain. His knees buckled, his breath ragged. The thought flickered. He might fall. He might never rise again. But then his eyes found Tala's. She knelt at the edge of the circle, her face streaked with tears. Her hands clasped as if holding the whole world together. In that gaze, Jesse found the last ember of fire he needed. His jaw clenched and he surged, twisting his body with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. The knives scraped, bone against stone. Sparks of will rather than fire. Red Hawk staggered back, the blade at his side dripping blood. Jesse swayed, dizzy, but still stood. The tribe roared, half in fury, half in awe. Spears shook in the air. Some warriors clamored to finish Jesse. Others cried for the duel to end. The circle fractured with noise. His side. She cradled his head, her tears falling onto his dust-streaked face. "You stood," she whispered. "That is all that matters." Jesse managed a faint smile, though his lips were cracked with blood. "Told you I'd come back standing." Red Hawk turned, his figure towering, his face shadowed by the sun. He raised his arms, calling for silence. Slowly, the tribe obeyed, the chaos ebbing like a tide. His gaze swept over his people, then back to Jesse and Tala. "This man has walked the fire. He has carried the river. He has faced my blade. He is no coward, no thief. He is seen." The words struck like thunder. The tribe shifted uneasily, but none dared defy their chief. Jesse felt the world tilting, darkness tugging at the edges of his sight. Tala's hand held him fast, grounding him. He wanted to speak, to thank her, to tell her love was worth every scar. But his voice failed. His eyes closed. The drums began again, not in frenzy but in solemn rhythm, echoing through the canyon like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The trial was over. Yet whether it marked the birth of peace or the dawn of new war, none could say. The decision had been made in blood.